Hello and welcome. I'm Tabragadamu. What are the causes for irregular migration in our sub-region? And what are the challenges migrants face? Any antidote for the crises? Joining me to explore those is Malalmbo Moonga of the International Organization for Migration Office in Ethiopia. Malalmbo Moonga, a very warm welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Migration, this is something that we run into every single day in this part of the world, correct?
Absolutely. And not just in this part of the world. I'm a migrant as well.
You're a migrant for a very good reason. At least you're not irregular, right? You're
No,
not. You are a regular migrant. I know there are several causes as to why people migrate. But when it comes to your work in Ethiopia, in the sub-region, what do you think are the main causes of migration?
Very good question. We always say that migration has so many different drivers. And if you look at Ethiopia, those drivers are multiple. They are complex. They are interconnected. There isn't a single driver of migration from Ethiopia. Any one migrant can be motivated by many different factors at the same time. So it's quite a complex situation. I mean, what is evident is that you have people that migrate out of their own choice and migrants who are...
Something that's personal.
Absolutely. So either searching for better economic opportunities, searching to reunify with family members in another part of the world, for marriage, for jobs, etc. But you also have migrants who are migrating for involuntary reasons or forced migration. So these will be people fleeing conflict. We have a devastating drought in Ethiopia right now, so that is compelling Ethiopians to migrate, from their home communities to other parts of the country, and some are also crossing the border. But it's also important to stress that for many migrants, the reality of migration is such that you can start off today as someone seeking a job in Saudi Arabia, but depending on how you migrate and who you are as well, that migration story might easily become involuntary. So you might make the personal decision to migrate, but if you use the services of a smuggler, there are chances that your migration story might include coercion, exploitation, and other forms of protection risks. So that is one part of the story. But I should also stress that Ethiopia's migration story is not always negative. There are many, quote-unquote, positive migration stories from this country. Ethiopia has contributed successful doctors, lawyers, athletes, many other, quote-unquote, positive migration stories around the world. So it's a very...
By generating migrants, is that what he's saying?
By generating migrants, but also benefiting from what migrants contribute back home in Ethiopia.
But they're insignificant, correct?
I wouldn't say so. If you look at the numbers of the amount of remittances, for instance, financial remittances that are sent back to Ethiopia by its migrants, both regular migrants but irregular migrants, is significant. We're looking at $4 billion in 2021 alone in the form of remittances.
Poverty is also one of the major causes, don't you think so?
I agree. The numbers also substantiate your conclusion. In fact, the vast majority of migration from Ethiopia is for economic purposes. So people looking for jobs or people looking for better livelihoods. So poverty is a compelling factor. And if you look at the communities where most migrants originate from, these are often communities facing significant economic distress.
So what are the traditional routes, if you will, that these migrants follow?
Interestingly, the well-known routes are the three. So the eastern route, to countries like Saudi Arabia and the Middle East.
Via Djibouti across to Yemen and then?
Absolutely. So Djibouti, Yemen and Somalia to a lesser extent being the most important transit countries. And then you have the southern route towards South Africa with countries like Kenya, Zambia, Malawi, Tanzania, etc. being important transit countries. And then, of course, you have the northern route towards Europe, mostly transiting through Sudan, other parts of North America, and then eventually into Europe. So these are the often cited migration routes. But what's often less discussed is the fact that in Africa, the vast majority of the migration is within Africa, not out of Africa. So for most migrants from the continent, they migrate mostly to neighboring countries or countries within their region, as opposed to outside of the region. So the popular narratives of waves of African migrants, for instance,
making it to Europe
and so forth, are not substantiated by facts.
So how do they organize themselves when they begin to think about leaving Ethiopia for various reasons, along these three corridors? What comes to mind first for these potential migrants?
That's a really good question, because the understanding the sort of like decision-making process of behind migration is just as important as figuring out what to do about it, be it positive migration or negative migration. In our interactions with migrants, their families, and many other actors who are involved, this process is often complex. It's not as straightforward as most of us would like to believe. So for many families, migration could be a way out, not just for that individual migrant, but for the whole family as a whole. So families will borrow money, sell assets to finance the migration of one migrant, with the understanding that this is the one person who will make it to South Africa, get a job, start a business, send money back that will pay for food, education, will pay for assets like better housing, etc. for the family. Right, that's part of the calculation that families make. For other migrants, the decision is often not their own decision, for lack of a better term. So we have currently in the communities, in most migrant sending communities in Ethiopia, brokers, facilitators who are actively recruiting Ethiopia's young people to embark on migration journeys for money and, unfortunately, for other forms of exploitation as well. So the narrative that's often given to these young people is the moment you make it to Saudi Arabia, you'll get a job, you earn 100,000 birr a month, your family's life will completely transform. So imagine you're a young man or a young lady hearing about this promised land, and you face diminished prospects in your own community. So obviously, the decision to migrate to Saudi Arabia becomes a rational choice you're making, because you weigh, you do a cost-benefit analysis, and you come to the conclusion that perhaps you're better off in Saudi Arabia than staying home. And then, of course, there are more coercive forms of human mobility, such as trafficking in persons, where migrants are recruited or coerced, made to cross borders, and then exploited either for their labor or into various industries, including exploited for sex as well, etc., and all for the sake of profit. So the decision-making process, the decisions made are just as important as the solutions that would like to propose.
Do they know that they're embarking on risky journeys to make it across, for example, to South Africa, across 5 or 6 countries along the route? Do they know that it is risky?
Some migrants do.
Before they get started, right?
Absolutely. So they do.
And they reach that decision to leave their own country.
We talk to migrants for sure. And I think for many migrants, it's not just a question of knowing the risks, but it's about the other risks as well of not migration, of not migrating, let me put it that way. So as I mentioned earlier, if your economic prospects are very diminished back home, your livelihood has been destroyed because of a crushing drought, the decision to migrate compares to the decision to stay in that community and facing those challenges, right? So that is what migrants weigh when they make those decisions. I don't think migrants are somehow unique from other human beings by not having a sense of self-preservation, not caring about their lives, somehow losing this ability to care about their well-being. They do care about their well-being, but again, it's about, if I don't migrate, what is in it for me where I am right now?
But the reason why I raised that question is we see, for example, how many Ethiopians are now behind bars in Tanzania? Something like 6,000 Ethiopians?
Yes, approximately 6,000 in detention.
In Tanzania.
Absolutely.
These are young people on their way to South Africa along that route.
Absolutely.
Do those stories make it back home to where those people came from?
They do make it back.
And what do people think about those stories?
Oh, it's very sad when families receive this information about, their family members detained in Tanzania or abducted in Yemen and Libya for ransom. And it's hard to relay this information to families and then seeing how they react to it, especially after they've made significant sacrifices to facilitate that migration. Migrants themselves, upon return to Ethiopia, share those stories. Some of our community awareness raising activities involve migrants who share their story, give advice to potential migrants, their friends, their peers, etc. So the information is there. The government is also embarking on significant sensitization efforts. IOM does the same. Civil society organizations are also doing this work.
Even then?
Even then, right? Information alone, awareness raising alone, in the absence of alternatives, real viable alternatives, is really not as powerful as we'd like to think.
So I would have thought otherwise. I would have thought, this could serve as basically as a deterrent to potential migrants, right? But it's not working that way, is it?
If you look at the numbers in absolute terms, no, it's not, because the numbers of irregular migrants are increasing by the year. But is it for a lack of information that more people are migrating? Certainly it isn't. We have to look at the complex drivers that are compelling Ethiopia's young people to migrate. That's what, we all should be focusing on and diverting, our creativity, our resources, our energy to addressing. And it's also not just about sharing the information so you can stop migrants from migrating irregularly, because you cannot stop migration. Migration is as old as humanity. The oldest human ancestors are thought to have migrated from Ethiopia, myself included.
So what's being done? You peripherally have navigated along that issue, but I want you to tell me what is being done to help curb these irregular migration, if you will. What is being done?
So there are several interventions by many different actors. But let me just take a step back in answering that question. as I mentioned earlier, I wouldn't say the priority should be to stop people from migrating. Yes, irregular migration is extremely dangerous, and is costly, to lives, economies, international relations between countries, etc. There are those costs. I'm not here to diminish them, but I think if we say that what we need to be doing is to stop people from migrating irregularly, we're going to fail, because how do you do that? Do you close off your country? You can't do that. We live in a highly globalized world where countries are interconnected, right? Information is widely available about migration and options, etc. So you can't really stop people from migrating, including migrating irregularly. I think what we should be doing is, first of all, reducing the need for people to migrate irregularly, right? By providing viable alternatives to irregular migration, but also creating pathways for people to migrate regularly. Because remember, there are significant benefits to well-managed migration, right? I spoke about remittances earlier.
Well, but you have poverty. I mean, you have to kind of address, some of them are root causes for migration.
Absolutely.
But poverty, as you said, conflicts. If you're at war, people tend to get out of those conflict zones and so on and so forth. And there are important issues that governments across the African continent need to do. That is, work on all these issues, address, drought issues, address conflicts.
Absolutely.
And so on and so forth.
You're absolutely right.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Those issues need to be addressed. But they should be addressed anyway, with or without migration. So, those issues absolutely merit our attention, and that is why we as IOM, in partnership with the government of Ethiopia and our many partners, dedicating our resources more and more towards such kind of initiatives. So we have community development initiatives, for instance, in the so-called migration hotspots that are trying to create local livelihood opportunities so that people have alternatives to irregular migration. And we're also working with the government of Ethiopia for them to have partnerships with other countries that need migrant workers so that the migration then becomes facilitated, organized, and within the bounds of the law. So we're doing all of that, and more needs to be done, for sure. We need to look at the education system. We need to provide jobs for Ethiopia's young people, right? The numbers are very, very intimidating. 2 to 3 million Ethiopians entering the job market every year. That's a lot of young people in need of livelihood opportunities. But really, is there an economy that can create that many jobs in a single year? Not even the biggest economies can do that. So that is why migration then becomes part of the solution. But it has to be a certain type of migration. It has to be well-governed. It has to be mutually beneficial for the two governments, but most importantly, it has to be beneficial for migrants and their families as well. And the ways in which you do that is what, requires, additional discussion, policy efforts, programs, engagement with the media. Thank you for this opportunity, etc. Many things need to be done.
How about human trafficking? That's part of this bigger picture that we're talking about now, right? I mean, it's serious, and women and girls are the hard hit in this court, right?
Absolutely. It's a very inhumane practice. Women, children are being trafficked, for various forms of exploitation. It's also a very lucrative business, and that is why organized criminal networks are more and more active in the trafficking of human beings. So it's a very serious issue.
How do you begin to address this? Would prosecuting the smugglers be top on the list?
Yes, Absolutely. It should be top on the list. Countries like Ethiopia, I think, need to do more to investigate cases as well as successfully prosecute those cases. But in addition to that, more needs to be done to identify victims of trafficking and ensure that they receive the necessary assistance for them to rehabilitate, recover from the trauma of trafficking, because this is a very violent experience that is highly traumatizing. So they need rehabilitation assistance and then reintegration, be it economic, social reintegration, so that they can resume their lives in Ethiopia. I think in addition to that, there's need for more international cooperation on this, because this is a cross-border crime. So cooperation on things like joint investigations, joint prosecution.
We have seen a couple of cases in the last 2 years, right?
Yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, those cases are too few in between. So we need more of that.
So among African countries, right?
Among African countries, but also among countries outside the continent as well. Because remember, it's not just the movement of persons across borders that's illicit with trafficking, but it's also the money that comes with that. And that money is not just sitting in African banks, it's sitting in European, Middle Eastern banks, for instance. And people are being trafficked to those destinations as well. So today, you might be trafficked to Djibouti, but your final destination might be in South Korea, for instance, in Asia somewhere. So really, it's a global priority, a global concern, and therefore, cooperation has to involve many more countries other than just African countries.
What does your experience inform you along that line?
On the international cooperation?
Are we there yet?
I think more needs to be done. The networks that are involved in this are getting more and more sophisticated in the way they conceal the crime, in the way they conceal the proceeds from that crime, in the way they evade law enforcement agencies. So countries, I think, need to do more to understand how modern-day trafficking is actually done, and then revise their laws, their investigations, their investigative practices, the way they interact with victims based on this understanding. So that needs to be done. But also I think the responsibility is not for governments alone. We as individuals, everyday people, have a role to play in all of this. So one of the worst forms of trafficking in countries like Ethiopia is, child trafficking into certain sectors such as agriculture, construction, weaving, forced begging on the streets, as well as domestic servitude. So we as individuals also have a role to play in all of this, to ensure that when we hire people to work for us, we pay a fair wage, we respect the labor laws, and really we just treat people as human beings. Absolutely. We have a role to play as well.
So we hope for the best, and thank you very much, Malalmbo Moonga. It was really a pleasure having you on my show, talk about this important issue.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.